You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is Brian McClanahan, your host, and this is episode 54, covering the week of January 9th through January 13th, 2017. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be with you. Coming a little bit late here because of some issues in my own household, but I'm glad to be back here on the program, and we had a great week at the Abbeville Institute from the 9th to the 13th. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to remember you all that the Abbeville Institute exists on your generous contributions alone. If you'd like to support this podcast or the website, please make a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute. Any amount would be welcome. That will help keep the lights on, help support all the things that we do, including our summer school and other programs. Also remember to follow us on Facebook, like us on Twitter, and like our YouTube channel, and share our material. If you go out to our social media accounts and you see something there you like, make sure you share it on your wall or tweet it or comment on it on YouTube. That way we keep the material flowing and get more people interested in our cause and helping explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Okay, so we had a pretty interesting week, I think, at the Abbeville Institute. We had some eclectic material, and the first of the week was actually a piece presented by William Hunter, and William Hunter was a doctor in South Carolina, in Clemson, South Carolina. He died about 8 years ago, but this piece was originally published in 1983, and it covers the Dan Sickles Affair, and when Dan Sickles shot and killed Barton Key, and Barton Key was the son of Francis Scott Key, and this was an interesting story in that Barton Key was having an affair with Dan Sickles' wife, and everyone in Washington, D.C. knew about it except Dan Sickles, and then one day he gets a letter in the mail saying that your wife is having an affair, and he goes and confronts his wife, and she confesses to the whole thing, and then as Dan Sickles is looking out the window, he sees Barton Key giving the sign that his wife would see, and of course they would meet up. And instead of Dan Sickles' wife seeing the sign, Dan Sickles sees it, so he walks out to Lafayette Square and shoots and kills Barton Key. The man who witnessed the murder was given some money by President James Buchanan at the time and got out of town very quickly, saying that if he stuck around, he'd probably end up in jail or even worse. And so the President of the United States actually had a hand in covering up the affair, and that's because he and Dan Sickles were very good friends. In fact, Dan Sickles was good friends with most people in Washington, D.C., including a large number of Southerners. Dan Sickles, in fact, was a Democrat, and so he had the support of a number of leading men in Washington, D.C. And this is actually an interesting story for this particular way, not just because of the cover-up, but because of how complex things were around 1860. In fact, Dan Sickles was generally supporting the South up until Fort Sumter in April of 1861. And he was also good friends with Edwin Stanton, and Edwin Stanton generally supported the South up until 1861. And I remember when I was working on my dissertation on James Byard of Delaware, and he was commenting about when Edwin Stanton was actually appointed Secretary of War. And Byard was in favor of Southern secession. He was in favor of Delaware actually leaving the Union. It didn't happen, but he secretly supported it. And he wrote a number of letters about this event when Stanton was appointed. And he was fairly confident this would be a good appointment because Stanton had long been someone who they believed they could trust. And so when Stanton became such a miserable person and so vindictive, Byard was shocked. In fact, he wrote a number of letters about this. He had a personal interview with Stanton and expressed dismay that Stanton had turned out to be such a scoundrel and pursuing with such vigor, arresting these opponents of the Lincoln administration. And so it's interesting how this complexity of this 1860 period, 1850s into the 1860s, how that worked out, and how a number of these Northerners who people thought they could trust became such ardent Unionists. And I think that what's also interesting about that is these people were not, Dan Sickles was not an abolitionist. Edwin Stanton was not really an abolitionist. But they were Unionists, and they supported the power of the federal government. And so their adherence to the principles of the Democratic Party was tenuous at best. But once the war took place, they decided that the winning side should be supported, and that side obviously was going to be the North, and they were going to use the power of the general government to their advantage. Now, General Sickles, he served as a general in the war and lost a leg at Gettysburg, as military governor of South Carolina, refused to foreclose on Confederate widows. And so President Johnson at the time countermanded the order, and when Stanton refused to support the president, he was removed from office, and that led to Johnson's impeachment. So there's a whole bunch of interesting things working here, but I think it shows the complexity of the issues here in the 1850s and going into the 1860s, that these people who thought could be counted on, Dan Sickles is from New York, these people that thought that Southerners thought they could count on for support, eventually turned their back on the South when things got hot. But Dan Sickles had already killed a very prominent Southerner in Barton Key. Now, of course, Barton Key was doing wrong, and he used the defense of temporary insanity, which had later been used all the time, particularly in matters of the heart, when a enraged husband would go out and kill the lover of his wife. But here you have a very interesting and famous story that goes with that, and the murder of Barton Key, when Dan Sickles was in the Buchanan administration. Now, of course, one of the things that's left out oftentimes in that is that Dan Sickles was often cheating on his wife. In fact, he had taken, when he was a young man in his 30s, and he was minister to England, he had taken a prostitute with him to England as his escort, and openly introduced her to the Queen. And so this is the same Dan Sickles who was of dubious moral character, who had a problem with his wife going out and sleeping with another man. So sometimes those things work out that way. But it's an interesting story. And again, the reason I think it's interesting politically is because of all the material that went on behind the scenes, and all these people behind the scenes who would later play such a role in the war. Now, the piece that we ran on Tuesday was a very important piece. Again, this was published back in the 90s, and was written by Sheldon Van Auken, who was actually from Indiana originally, but became an important defender of the South and the Southern tradition. And this is actually an interesting idea. Van Auken being from Indiana, not from a Southern state, but someone who admired what the South had to offer. And coming up this next weekend, we have an invite-only conference being held in South Carolina on this very topic. What is a Southern tradition, and what does it offer for America? And so I think this piece by Van Auken speaks to that, and it's entitled Old Western Man, C.S. Lewis and the Old South. And of course, C.S. Lewis never was interested in the Southern tradition. But what Van Auken does here is attach C.S. Lewis's very famous address that he gave in the 1950s as he was appointed to Cambridge as a professor at Cambridge. He was not appointed to Oxford, which he wanted, but he was appointed to Cambridge, and he gave an address. And this particular address was widely received and hailed as a fantastic treatise on the study of history. And it's interesting how Van Auken is able to take this particular address, this discussion of history, and apply it to the South. And so, of course, Lewis said that when you look at history and people examine history, they often say the great divide between the modern era and the traditional world was the Renaissance, and how the Renaissance acceptance of secular humanism and science became really the downfall of Christianity and the downfall of the Old West. And so, the fall of Rome took part of that as Rome fell, and then you had the Middle Ages. Oftentimes, the Middle Ages was seen as this, of course, by a lot of people, this very dark age period, but a lot of people were trying to revive that as actually a pretty brilliant time in the history of Christianity. But then you have the Renaissance and how that undoes the undoing of everything that is Christian, and of course, it's the downfall of Christianity. But that's not what C.S. Lewis said. He said that the Great Divide was not necessarily the fall of Christianity and the Renaissance, but it was more or less the development of secular humanism over time in this post-Christian world. It was de-Christianization. And that is the Great Divide. And he says it's not really the Renaissance, it's actually the 19th century when this takes place. And so Lewis called himself an old Western man. He actually says, Lewis says it's the time between Jane Austen and Sir Walter Scott at the end of the 18th century and a little way into the 19th. And so he calls himself an old Western man because he is someone who's living in this late 18th, early 19th century before the Great Divide. And it was science that actually destroyed this old Western man. And so what Van Auken does is he takes these different positions that Lewis articulated, and he says there are six terms which apply to any society. We have political aspects of this Great Divide. Instead of calling our politicians rulers, we now call them leaders. And of course, he says now the job of a politician is to whip up feelings, appeals, drives, campaigns. We have a vast computerized bureaucracy which penetrates our lives and fortunes as no government of the past ever did. Where we once asked rulers for justice and incorruptibility, we now want magnetism and charisma. He says economically there's a divide, and of course it's the coming of the machine. Where we once wanted government to defend us from enemies, foreign and domestic, we paid taxes for those purposes. We now expect everything from government: jobs, relief from poverty, health care. Government is spending trillions it doesn't have, and money without its intrinsic value, not gold. Socially, he says, the family's in decay. The rock-hard institution of old Western man, marriage itself, is breaking down. Multi-marriages, or so to speak, serial polygamy, or no marriage at all. Social morality is all but dead. And for good or ill, since Lewis's lecture, a change that would almost be unbelievable to old Western man, a change as great as any in history, and he calls that feminism, or unisexism. Religious changes, de-Christianization. Intellectually, it's the onset of ideology, and how that changes everything else, killing in the name of ideology. And science, and how that has become such an important part of ideology. We've had change in aesthetics. He said the world is almost unrecognizable. The visual arts has become so aesthetically different. If you just look at modern art compared to classical art, or the Old West. Our literature has changed. Everything has changed. And when Lewis finished, he called himself a dinosaur, a dino. And, of course, this reminded me of an old Hank Williams Jr. Song, which was entitled Dinosaur. And he says he's a dinosaur, should have died out a long time before. And when you read this, I think a lot of people who favor the Southern tradition believe that. I mean, we are dinosaurs, so to speak. We're old Western men. And so that's where Van Auken says, look, the real old Western men in the United States were in the South. Because the South held on to this old Western man longer than anywhere else. And in fact, the war was the fullest expression of the old Western man. Southerners were trying to beat back this modernization. Now, what's interesting with that is that, of course, you have people like Eugene Genovese and others who had said that the South was modern in a era which their sense of modernity was different than the North. They wanted to be modern, but they didn't want to be modern in the machine age, so to speak. And they thought that their society was actually modern in its own way. But I think what Van Auken says is, no, these people were trying to hang on to old Western Christianity. He says that, and he supports Mel Bradford in this, that Southern theologians were not favoring secession to support slavery, but to protect Christianity. And when you read those Southern theologians, they do make comments about the evil effects of what would happen should the North win. And it wasn't just, of course, the abolition of slavery. It was the unleashing of this modern sensibility, this modern drive to reform every element of society. And they pointed out what would happen. Should the North win, you're going to see essentially this French Revolutionary style egalitarianism sweep the United States. And it's not just going to end slavery, it would change everything in the social order. And I think they've been proven correct in that way. And of course, Van Auken says that General R.E. Lee is a symbol of the actuality of the South. Oxford taught that he was the greatest general since Alexander the Great because he did so much with so little and because he won the total devotion of his men. But Van Auken says Lee is far more than a brilliant and audacious general. In his simplicity and grandeur, he is the best of the Old South, and he is almost incomprehensible to modern sensibility. Like George Washington, he is seen as a marble man by moderns who have no trouble understanding Lincoln or Sherman, both rather modern themselves. But General Lee, never giving way to hate nor blaming anyone else, the simplicity, the strange words that we have lost, words like duty and honor. But an old Roman would understand them. Lee, I think, and Stonewall and Jeb Stuart are old Western men. And so Van Auken says, when Lee came at last to Appomattox and the short-lived Confederacy went down, not just to defeat, but to non-existence, and Oxford Don wrote lines that no one today would write. A drastically different point of view. No nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime. And so Van Auken closed with a question. As Richard Weaver says so powerfully, the Southern tradition is at bay. Does it still survive? Are we who hold to that tradition old Western men? If we are dismayed by multiculturalism, by deconstructionism, by moral relativism, have we any hope of holding on to and of passing on that tradition? I do not know. I cannot precisely define what new Western man is, though there have been many hints along the way. He says, I cannot close without saying, as the Cambridge undergraduates did, that I, to no one's surprise, take my stand as a dino, and hope that I and fellow dinos can make a difference. And this is what the conference this upcoming weekend is going to discuss. What can we do as dinos, so to speak? And really what we're doing is defending this Old West, this Old Western tradition. In fact, the Southern tradition really is an extension of the Old West. The Old Western tradition, the Old Western civilization. And the good parts of that, what can we do with those? What can they offer for the future of America? I've said in this podcast many times that the South is America. And that's true. The South is a vision of America which I think has been resurrected slightly here recently with the 2016 election. We'll see. But it's a vision of America where perhaps federalism has a place, where kith and kin, where community has a place, where we really are, in so many ways, multicultural, in that perhaps this Jeffersonian vision of small is beautiful will take hold. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is going to do that, because I think that the evidence is on the wall, that the writing's on the wall, that he is a devout nationalist, and we're going to have top-down solutions, which is precisely the wrong thing we should be doing. But Trump tapped into this idea that there is a forgotten man there. That, and of course, someone like William Graham Sumner pointed this out in the late 19th century. This forgotten man is important. We need to remember this forgotten man, this person that goes out and pays taxes and works and gets squeezed. The rich get the breaks and the poor get the breaks, but the forgotten man, the man in the middle that ends up footing the bill in so many different ways, gets squeezed and doesn't get anything. So Trump tapped into that, particularly in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan. But what can the South offer in this entire process? What parts of the Southern tradition that we explore as in the Abbeville Institute, what can we offer to that? And I think, again, the political principles of Jeffersonianism are going to be there. I think that some of the traditional elements of the South, in terms of its culture, will still be there. Perhaps Christianity, the South, no matter what race you're discussing in the South, has long held on to Christianity longer than any other section. And so perhaps the South can offer that. Of course, the South, and we've discussed on this podcast, and of course at the Abbeville Institute, maybe this anti-imperialist strain of the South. Maybe that will become part of our foreign policy. Southerners did have an anti-imperialist tradition. And so perhaps that will become part of the American polity moving forward, at least for a few years. So there are things the South can offer. Moving forward, the Southern tradition, things that the Southern tradition can offer. And if you look back at, I think the most important period of time in Southern history that we often overlook is the PostBalmera. And when you look back at, say, the Woodrow Wilson administration, for example, you had people like Oscar Underwood of Alabama. He was the author of the Underwood Tariff, and that reduced the tariff. Of course, you also saw increases in the income tax at that point. And my position on these postbellum Southerners has always been that now that the apparatus had been put in place, the central government was going to be powerful, they were going to use it to get back at big business. So you had the Clayton Antitrust Act, for example, written by Henry de Lamar Clayton of Alabama. You had the Glass-Steagall finance reform on Carter Glass and Henry Steagall, Glass of Virginia, Steagall of Alabama. So you had Southerners using the apparatus that had been put in place against these banking interests, which had long harmed the South, and of course, everyday Americans. They thought they would use the government to get back at those people. It was very much an agrarian-minded advance in that early 20th century. And also what's interesting, you have maybe Southern ideas on labor after the war is over, which now are becoming very much in vogue. Southerners were much more interested in a paternalistic type of labor system where it was a much more a family environment. And you see this very popular in places like Google and other companies. Where they have, great benefits and working environment. Well, Southerners have been doing that for years. And a couple of years back, I published a piece about the Callaway family in Georgia. and how they were so interested in ensuring that their workers were treated like men and not like machines. And I think that's very much part of the Southern tradition that people can hang on to. And in, around where I live, you still have companies that do that. Companies like TSYS and Aflac. They are interested in having a much more family-oriented environment in their companies, and that very much comes out of the South. And so that part of the Southern tradition, treating your workers fairly, being much more interested in fair trade instead of this crony free trade, which we don't really have free trade. It's not that. So all of these things come out of the South, and I think that's what the South can offer to America as we're moving forward. And what Van Auken is saying is that, of course, there's a cultural part of that too. If the South is simply just grits and sweet tea, we're done. If that's just the Southern tradition today, or maybe a country music tune, we're done. So what the South has to do is be very proud of what it is and moving forward, and not let people say that it's just simply a backward society. It's not. I think when we talk about the permanence of family and land and property and order, and of course things like a non-interventionist foreign policy and political decentralization, all these things come out of the Southern tradition. And the South is America in those ways, because that Jeffersonian vision of America had long led America. And it's just the Lincolnian vision that took it over. And I think what we're seeing in some ways is a pushback to that. Now, again, Trump has his problems with that. I think that he is a nationalist, and so in that particular way, there are some issues there. But perhaps some of the people who are involved in the Trump administration and who are now, running state politics, can advance a much more decentralized agenda. And so we should be supporting that all over the United States, including things like Californians who, of course, Southerners would not agree with on a variety of issues, but their position that they want to have more autonomy, we should support that. Because, again, the states can do more and should do more to protect their citizens against, conservative nationalism. There should be no problem with that. All right, so on Wednesday we ran a piece by Clyde Wilson. It's a very short piece where he brings up, used to be we knew differences. And so he says, American people would be better if they could learn the difference between things like investors and speculators, the Constitution ratified by the people of the states and the one promulgated by federal judges, education and training, necessary taxation and oppressive burden, national defense and foreign interventionism, law enforcement and war, justifiable borrowing and destructive irresponsible debt, entertainment and moral debasement, celebrity and worth, status and wisdom, status and virtue, affirmative action and equal treatment under the law, a citizen and a non-citizen, a guest and an invader, a conservative, quote-unquote, and a conservative, public life informed by Christianity and politicized churchmen. And he says, and especially the American people would profit if they learn not to believe that politics is the realm of doing good. Politics is the realm of vanity, greed, lust, deception, and force. On Thursday, we ran a piece by Henry Boykin of Camden, South Carolina. It's a little piece of fiction, well, kind of fiction, kind of not fiction, about a hunting club that his father used to run in Camden. And it's about one of the people who was associated with that hunting club, a man named Papa Dawes, who was an African-American, and talks about how Papa Dawes was such a well-respected person. He actually was purchased by his family, two families, in fact, to get him out of slavery because he was illegally enslaved. And so these men purchased his freedom, and then he became a very well-respected man around the plantation as an overseer. And it's a very interesting story, in this hunting club, and how Boykin's father used to tell these stories when they're out on the hunt. And so it's a great little piece, and it doesn't take long to read it, but I think it's worth your time. And then on Friday, we ran a piece by the great Mel Bradford entitled A Window on the West. And this was actually published in 1983. And it was about Romania and how Bradford had gone to Romania and Bucharest and he was watching the Romanian people. And, of course, he says the United States abandoned Romania during the early days of the Cold War, when you had the various sit-downs between the big three, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And then that was at Yalta, and later at Potsdam, when Truman basically gave up the farm to Stalin, abandoned Romania. And, of course, Romania was then put under the Soviet heel. And I think the great thing about this piece is two things. One, millennials don't understand what communism actually is. They run around talking about how great it is, these snowflakes, Bernie Sanders supporters, and you see it all over the left. We need to have communism, we need to have, this Marxist society. But when you see what it actually did and how people yearned to get rid of it, I think that's an important part of this piece. But also, one of the things that's interesting about Romania is that they never gave up their old culture, even in the midst of the boot, of the Iron Curtain. They held on to the past. They held on to this very provincial, conservative way of life. And I remember I had a student from Romania years ago, and she said she was very disappointed when the West came in and communism fell, because they all expected it to be much better than it was. And she said all they really got out of it were cowboy movies and dance music and drugs. And that the old culture of Romania was destroyed by the West. And that they were very upset about this, because they thought that old traditional order, you see more churches now in Russia than really anywhere else in Europe. They're being built at a rapid pace because these people had held on underground to Christianity, and it's having a rebirth all throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. These Orthodox churches are being reborn. And the picture that we used on the website of Romania, it's an Orthodox church in the middle of this little farming village in Romania. And these things are going up all over the place because Christianity had been so repressed in the Soviet bloc. And when the Soviet bloc fell, the revival of Christianity is striking, really. And I think that's one thing we can learn from, say, Eastern Europe. And it can apply to the Southern tradition in that Southern culture has been repressed, Southern tradition has been repressed, but if it could just have a spark, it could be revived. Now, maybe it's already gone. As I just said a few minutes ago, if all we have is sweet tea and grits, well, then the Southern tradition is doomed. There's nothing left, really. It's just a caricature of itself. We're going to have football, sweet tea, grits, barbecue, and a country music tune. If that's all the Southern tradition is anymore, well, then it's gone. And I hope that's not the case, but I think there's a lot of evidence that could be the case. But maybe it's still there. It's just underneath the surface, and we're being told so often that it's just a backwards thing, a bad thing. But I think a lot of Southerners realize it's not. Attachment to land, attachment to family, and old traditions and Christianity, a different way of looking at the world, different way of looking at labor. Southerners should embrace this much more humane way of looking at labor. We don't have to be, northern industrialists and grind people down to a pulp, make them sawdust. You can treat people like people and have a different way of looking at labor. And that should be the example for the world. We have a different way of looking at politics and saying, you know what? We look at things where people can control their own destiny. We believe in self-determination. That's the American tradition. If California wants to be independent, go for it. We support you in that endeavor. If you want to have your own social and political system in your own state, we'll go for it. Your own economic system, go for it. We support your endeavor in those ways. And I think that's one thing, as Bradford was looking at Romania, he saw the South in that, these people being, suppressed. And Southerners are there, and they want to celebrate what they are, both white and black in the South. They want to celebrate what they are, but yet they can't because they're told they're wrong for doing so. And so if we can get anything out of the Southern tradition, if there's anything we can pull from it, I hope we would do it, and in these next 4 years, maybe we'll have a much more sympathetic voice, a much more sympathetic, quote-unquote, national voice, even though nationalism is a problem, in celebrating who we are. As Bradford said, we have to remember who we are first, and then you can celebrate who you are. And I hope in the coming years, we have an inauguration coming up, we have a change of the guard, so to speak, in Washington, D.C. I hope that in the coming years, Southerners will embrace that much more readily, and we can continue to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition and promote those things to a much wider audience. And that's what we're doing here in this podcast. So if you like this podcast and you like what we do, again, share it around with your friends, and help us continue to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Until next time, good day.